Hi, this is Eric Weinstein. Thanks for coming back to my YouTube channel. It's been a little while since I posted that first video asking for suggestions of what content I might try to put out, and I've gotten a lot of great feedback. So I've been looking at your comments and have been thinking about what videos might be the most interesting. I thought, however, I should start first with a question of why the intellectual dark web has such a crazy name. So I believe that I'm guilty. I introduced the phrase intellectual dark web on stage at the Masonic Theater with Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris. And then Sam titled that episode of his podcast, The Intellectual Dark Web, and that was later amplified by Barry Weiss and others. And Barry's article in the New York Times particularly got a lot of play. So a lot of people have asked, why does this movement have such a strange and crazy name? And I thought I would talk a little bit about the thinking that went into it, given that the first wave of reactions, I think, has really started to peter out. So there's still a few fresh takes, but for the most part, the big players have already commented, and I wanted to let that time pass before I clarified it further. All right, so there's a little bit of design behind the name. The central thesis is that what is now called the commentariat was always going to hate both the emergent phenomenon of the movement and hate any name that we attach to it. Why is that? Is it because the ideas are terrible? Is it because the people involved in the movement are deplorable? I don't think so. It's specifically because what the intellectual dark web actually is an alternative sense-making collective. So in this case, the so-called IDW will take what is ever happening in the world and will try to analyze it. But very often, it sounds very different than what you see in typical mainstream publications, particularly those that we on the left have depended upon for curating the interpretations of what is happening in the world. So whether that's the Atlantic or National Public Radio or the New York Times, these organizations have recently behaved quite differently than many of us remember them, let's say, 20 years ago. The so-called commentariat, that is, the people who regularly give their takes on what's happening in the world, seem to have been somewhat captured by a new network which thinks in terms that are very different to the networks that have previously lived at these organizations. And as a result, I believe that the intellectual dark web is going to be perceived as rivals. And then, therefore, instead of the commentariat giving an accurate assessment of what we're doing, they're going to view us as a rival to their business model, and they're going to attack on those terms. Therefore, because of their power and influence, which while waning is still considerable, we always knew that whatever name this phenomenon had, it was always going to be beaten up by the commentariat. So what we decided, or at least what I decided in introducing the name, was to use what I call an estufagem strategy. Now that word, I guess, is Portuguese, and it comes from the process that produces the wine named Madeira. And Madeira is really distinguished because it's the only wine that I know of that when you open it up, you can leave it open and it doesn't go bad. It doesn't behave like a normal agricultural product. Why is that? Because it's been subjected to heating and oxidization in a process called estufagem. Therefore, the product is sort of born, to use Nassim Taleb's phrase, in an anti-fragile state. And that was the idea behind naming this movement the intellectual dark web, or IDW. As a result, because it's got such a crazy, and some people would say cringeworthy or disturbing or self-important name, it's hard to beat up on it further than it already has been beaten up on at birth. So from inception, it's a very easy thing to make fun of. That guaranteed that we would have high mimetic acceptance. That is, the commentariat actually, in some sense, loves the name. And so they would spread it. So if you like, it's also a bit of a Trojan horse strategy, and that's what they did. They spread this name far and wide, making fun of it as much as they could. And the fun part about it is that there are a couple of jokes in the name, which I will now explain since I think that they've kind of outlived their usefulness as jokes. And the first one is on the word dark. Now, the word dark has two basic interpretations here. The first interpretation is something that's hard to find. So if you go dark, it means that you're sort of in stealth mode. Now, we have not really been in stealth mode, as many people have pointed out. For example, Paul Krugman. Hi, Paul, if you're out there. Now, why is that funny? Well, it's funny because the only people to whom we've been dark have been the mainstream media, which have not wanted to talk about a rival sense-making network. So, in essence, you see very few opportunities to engage with these ideas at the main media institutions that have traditionally been behind the discussion of intellectual matters in the United States and elsewhere, at least in the Anglophone world. So part of it is a joke on the media, which is that they don't want particularly to feature us as responsible and interesting commentators on events. They instead prefer to either treat us as strange and controversial figures, like controversial Professor Jordan Peterson, or far-right activist Ben Shapiro, or noted Islam critic Sam Harris. Now, in so doing, what they're doing is they're setting you up with the idea that these people hold ideas that are perhaps not savory, not acceptable. And that gets to the second issue going on with the word dark. The other notion of dark here is evil or morally bankrupt. And that's part of the joke too, because I don't think that this network is full of people who are morally bankrupt. Quite the contrary. I think it's a group of people looking for a more decent notion of politics, a more decent notion of intellectualization. So in essence, we are neither dark in the sense that we're hard to find, nor are we dark in the sense that we're pushing for something terribly disturbing. And as a result, when the news media tried to figure out what we were, they fundamentally were of two minds about it. So one would be that we are dark because we shouldn't be listened to, and therefore we can't be platformed. Or, this is ridiculous, don't you realize that these people have wild followings and huge audiences? So you can't really easily make both arguments. By the same token, if you think about the notion of dark as in evil, one of the arguments is that we're self-important and claiming that we have such dangerous ideas when in fact everything we talk about is totally banal and uninteresting. That's one way of attacking us. And the other way of attacking us, of course, is to say that what we're talking about has to be deplatformed because these are the discarded ideas of a backward past. As far as the intellectual aspect, well, look, you can always make the argument that people who are behaving in an intellectual space are not intellectuals, but there's no shortage of PhDs in this network. I don't think that people are listening for 3-hour stretches to programs that aren't stimulating their minds. I think what's going on is that this network is fundamentally simply trying to point out that another network has arisen. And because that other network lives inside of the major media institutions of yesteryear, we don't really recognize how radical the shift in perspective has been over the last, let's say, well, particularly the last 5 years. Over the last 5 or perhaps 10 years, the shift inside of places like CNN and like the New York Times has been dramatic. It is now not possible to cover stories that go counter-narrative to the narratives held at a place like the New York Times. So, for example, when my brother Brett Weinstein's campus at Evergreen State College started to experience something that, at least from the outside, looks indistinguishable from a Maoist takeover, according to the videos, the New York Times took over 3 weeks in their news division to cover the story, despite the fact that there had been 2 opinion pieces written on this very strange breakdown in civil society at Evergreen State. Why was that? Why could a story that was exciting and interesting not be covered? Well, in fact, what was going wrong was that it was a counter-narrative nightmare. It was a story of an eruption of racism, but racism held by blacks on the campus, not by whites. And the anti-racists were white and not black. Therefore, the story couldn't actually be reported, and therefore there was a 3.5-week gap between when the story unfolded and when they finally wrote a first terrible news piece, even after 2 opinion pieces had already been written. So this is what's happening from our perspective. is that there's suddenly all sorts of stories that can't be reported honestly because they go counter-narrative to this new network that has taken over the major institutions that we've previously relied upon, particularly on the center left. So that's NPR, CNN, New York Times, and magazines like The Atlantic. Now, if you wanted to understand what's really motivating the intellectual dark web, why do you have a collection of people that really doesn't have a particular hue, doesn't have a common religion or a common ethnic group, it doesn't have a common political ideology? I believe what's animating us is the complete disappearance of a previous consensus around the idea that Enlightenment values should be used to adjudicate rival sense-making interpretations. That is, when you have two interpretations of what is going on, do you go back to data? Do you try to relate it to other theory? Do you attempt to ask thought experiments in order to try to figure out which is the most reliable interpretation? Or do you rely on a rival system that we're only coming to understand based around personal destruction? So, as far as we can tell, in the new system, the new network that has invaded the previous mainstream media organs is very focused on reputational destruction of people who offer rival sense-making. That is, if somebody suggests, for example, that, let's take online chess. World chess standings. I believe of the top 100 chess players, only one of them is female. Now, I have no idea why that is, but I can come up with buckets. I can say, well, some amount of this is cultural, some amount of this is systemic bias, some amount of this is biology, some amount of this is socialization. But whatever is going on, it's very unlikely that the right way to begin such a discussion is to assume that the representation must be 50-50 if it's fair, and that any deviation from 50-50 generally has to represent some kind of structural bias against one group by another. The fact that we can't have that conversation is not particularly important in the world of chess. Who cares about chess? Nobody cares about chess. I think what's frightening to people is the idea that you can't ask the question, might this have something to do with biological differences? I mean, 99-1, it just doesn't make sense to exclude that and settle on an oppression narrative from the get-go. So because that example doesn't really matter much to anyone because chess isn't determining the fate of the world, it's sort of a clean place to ask the question of why we should be listening to a group of people that doesn't seem capable of setting up a scientific hypothesis and testing it. I would say that what characterizes the network that has taken over our mainstream organs is that it is intrinsically hostile to the idea of investigating its claims. And this is very much what happened, for example, to my brother. I don't think people understood that there was a lot of hostility because he used words like genotype and phenotype as a biologist, which the activists at Evergreen State took to be evidence that he was clearly a racist, which I'm sorry to say is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard in my life. If I hadn't seen it on video, I would not believe that people were capable of making that argument. It's just a shock. And the fact that that style of argumentation has spread so quickly and has penetrated the organs that we have always depended upon and have a very long and storied history, I think is probably what animates the intellectual dark web. So to wrap up the reasons for the name, the idea was we wanted to create a name that was highly mimetic. We knew it was going to be beaten up on. We wanted it to be born anti-fragile. And we wanted it also to be understandable as an emergent phenomenon. So, whether or not I named it, it was always going to be a thing. If you come to any of the shows that we do in different cities, if you watch the view counts, even when the platforms like YouTube and Twitter seem to not make our lives easy. This has tremendous traction. People are incredibly excited about finding that there is some place to discuss ideas again. And furthermore, that we can do so decently without, in general, resorting to epithet and reputational destruction unless somebody else usually initiates hostility towards us. I think it's an incredibly hopeful movement, and I want to say more about it in future videos as to what really characterizes the movement, what its interests are. But I wanted to begin by letting you know that the crazy name is not an accident. It's really born out of a frustration that we know that we're going up against the people that you usually have depended upon to curate your world and its interpretations. And what we are is a rival curation network. And we don't agree with each other. I mean, one of the funny things about it is that we're frequently told that we are a right-of-center organization where, if I have to be honest, when I sit inside the network, I definitely think it has a left-of-center bias. And the fact that the left is so far gone that it sees that as right-of-center, I think, speaks volumes. I think about, Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, myself, Sam Harris, Heather Heying. There's no shortage of people on the left, and I would definitely say that the movement is in general not particularly friendly to the current administration sitting inside of the White House. And the fact that it can't be understood or reported to be what it actually is in part what we wanted to show you. We want to show you the failure of the commentariat. And I think that until you see this layer, which prefers to be almost invisible by virtue of making itself nearly, maybe it's translucent. You can sort of see it a little bit, but they really want you to focus on their interpretation of the facts rather than the facts themselves. And by calling too much attention to themselves, that goes away. I think what we're trying to do is to highlight that the curation is almost at the level of a Potemkin village. You're being shown very limited perspectives, and you're seeing a lot of variation around these perspectives. But maybe the real action is a million miles away from the sort of center of mass as determined by the left and right-wing commentariat as we now understand them. So I think what the intellectual dark web, or IDW, is going to do is going to move that considerably, move the foci on left and right considerably off of where the normal media institutions have been discussing matters, particularly on matters like trade, immigration, terror, and let's say workplace opportunity. So I hope you'll get excited about this and you'll start to see the humor in it, because we threw out a MacGuffin. And sure enough, everybody in the commentariat saw exactly what it was that they wanted to see. Maybe we were an anti-Semitic network. Maybe we were an overly Jewish network. Some people saw us as being almost exclusively male. Some people saw this as an ethnic network. All of these things are just not true, and that's what's funny. It's amusing. We hope you're in on the joke now, and we hope that, furthermore, it's not a terrible name once you get used to it. So get excited. There's more to come, and thanks for watching, and greetings from the IDW. Be well.